Earlier this week, NATO ministers were here in Washington to mark the alliance's 70th anniversary and talk about moving forward. Tonight, Brett Baer talks with the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about NATO's present and its future.
Mr. Secretary General, thanks for the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
70 years ago this week, the NATO treaty was signed here in Washington, and at that time, President Truman said, "We hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression." I want to ask you about what Russia is doing now. Is that aggression?
We see a pattern of Russian behavior where they use many different tools and measures to try to intimidate and also to destabilize neighbors, some partners, some NATO allies, which has triggered the biggest reinforcement of NATO since the end of the Cold War. We have seen that in Ukraine, where Russia, for the first time since the end of the Second World War, one country in Europe has taken apart another by force. We have seen, different kinds of attempts to meddle in democratic processes in different NATO allied countries. We have seen the use of a nerve agent against the United Kingdom in Salisbury, and we have seen, of course, Russia's support for the murderous regime in Syria.
Some of those countries, NATO members, there has to be some fear of aggression or future aggression. How do you counter that?
By standing together and delivering what we call strong deterrence and strong defense. We are now strengthening NATO with the combat-ready troops in the eastern part of the alliance for the first time in our history. Significantly increased readiness of forces so they can quickly move in if necessary. All of this sends a very clear signal to any potential adversary that NATO is willing and is ready and capable of defending all allies. And that's the best way not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict.
French President Macron said in recent months that Europe needs a European army. One, is he right? And two, how realistic is that?
We welcome EU efforts on defense, but we don't support anything that can be outside the NATO framework or undermine the transatlantic unity. European efforts on defense is good, but it must not compete with, but complement the efforts of NATO.
Do you support the deployment of American intermediate-range missiles to counter what Russia is doing?
We don't have any intentions of deploying new nuclear ground-launched or land-based missiles in Europe, but we will make sure that NATO is able to deliver credible deterrence and defense also in the world where the INF Treaty doesn't any longer exist, because Russia is now violating that treaty and deploying new missiles, and we have to respond to that.
You mentioned provoking Russia. Is putting more U.S. troops in Europe a provocation?
No, and therefore I welcome the fact that the United States has increased its military presence in Europe, because we see a pattern of behavior of Russia which requires that we are responding.
There is a concern in many corners, both left and right, that somehow the U.S. will be drawn in because of Article 5 if Russia has some further aggression in one of these NATO countries to something bigger. How realistic is that threat?
First of all, we don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally, and the main reason for that is that NATO is strong, and any potential adversary knows that if they attack one country, it will trigger a response for the whole alliance. We have to remember that the only time we have invoked our Article 5, the collective defense clause, was after an attack on the United States, 9/11, and hundreds of thousands of European troops and Canadian troops have served together with US troops in Afghanistan, and also, for instance, in the global coalition to defeat Daesh, ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
If the U.S. draws down in Afghanistan, will NATO draw down?
We went in together and we will leave together. But the main focus now is on the peace negotiations, which is led by the United States, and we hope that that will lead to a peaceful settlement that will enable us to reduce and eventually also then leave. But we are committed to stay as long as needed, because Taliban must understand that they will never win on the battlefield.
The president has said and pushed for NATO countries to spend more on defense. You've backed up that call. How would you describe that effort from a NATO point of view?
So President Trump has been very clear. NATO allies have to spend more. I totally agree, but also NATO allies agree. His message is having a clear impact. After years of reducing defense budgets, NATO allies are now increasing defense budgets. And by the end of next year, they will have added 100 billion extra for defense. And that makes a difference. That shows that European allies are now stepping up. They still have a long way to go, but this is now really going in the right direction.
His supporters and administration officials say that's proof that the president is strengthening NATO. Critics of the president say with his rhetoric, he is weakening NATO. Which one is it?
The fact that NATO allies are now investing more, that is, of course, strengthening NATO. My message to the US Congress this week is that also the United States needs friends, because through NATO you have more friends and more allies than any other power. Russia doesn't have anything like that. China doesn't have anything like that. I like America to fully understand how grateful we are in Europe for the strong commitment of the United States to Europe, but also the European commitment to the United States and North America is important for the United States. Even big eyes need friends, and you have a lot of friends in NATO.
You mentioned China. How much of NATO's effort should be focused to counter China? How much is NATO's effort doing that?
So first of all, what we do now, with significantly investing more in defense, increasing the readiness, modernizing our forces, training, exercising more, developing new technologies, that is relevant for any potential adversary. So this is not directed against any specific nation, but of course, by standing together, we are just strong enough to protect all allies against any potential challenge.
Mr. Secretary General, we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.